What's up, man?
I'm back.
I'm laughing because you're creating more controversy, and I hear all these mutterings from across the pond about all the controversy you're creating.
Wow. What a way to start. What a way to start a podcast, huh? Hey, welcome, guys. David Rams is back, and I've heard he's been causing some crap. Yeah, that's giving people a great impression if they've never heard of me.
So actually, no. I mean, I think this is useful controversy, and this is
okay.
I mean, I would have had you back on anyways because I love talking to you, and you know that.
Yeah.
But
I wanted to come back on too.
I definitely heard some hate. There are people who kind of ironically basically said, "Oh, here's another cisgender white guy talking on and on," you know. And and you'll explain why that's ironic for people to say that in just a moment.
Yeah.
But I also heard surprisingly from a lot of folks who I wouldn't have expected to say, "Hey, that was actually thought provoking," and I think there's some conversations that need to be had about this. And people are probably guessing a little bit about what this controversy is about, but tell us about this talk that you gave at, I know the acronym is IARC, and I'm actually not sure what it stands for. Is it International Animal Rights Conference or?
International Animal Rights Conference, exactly. Okay. International Animal Rights Conference.
So talk at IARC and why it stewed so much controversy in the movement.
Well, okay, so for the full story, let's not start there. Let's start with the actual, because there's a lot to this. So years and years ago, I had been told about these conferences like IARC and some other ones, and I'd been told that people are like me, for example, people who go out there and do lots of street outreach, and people who are very unapologetic and quite, I suppose, what they would call toxic, I think, were very, very unwelcome in these places. And I'd always felt that was kind of strange because I didn't see myself as toxic. I didn't see myself as a problem. I just go out there and talk about animals as a priority, and I specifically focus on animals. So
toxic, Dave.
Yeah, right, I know.
That's ridiculous.
So I didn't really understand it. So after years of this, recently, this was years and years ago, and I started to kind of change a little bit in my mind and start to be a little bit more, okay, well, maybe I should try to be more open-minded to what these people have to say in these places. So,
so we started toxic specifically. It can't just be because you're literally talking about animals. I mean, what was this?
No, it's not like anybody said that to me. It's just the people around me told me that these places were quite hostile to people who are who go out and literally only talk about animals. They see you as like a problem, and because they obviously want to talk about human rights issues as well.
I see. Okay, because you're not talking about all the other kind of
basically, yeah. So this is the message I got, and I decided, well, at one point I decided, let me find out for myself. So, and we have projects going on as well where a lot of the people we're working with also go to these conferences. So there was kind of like a bridge there already, in that I knew that these people didn't hate me. Maybe some do, but I knew that definitely not the majority. So it started to kind of build a bridge for me to say, oh, maybe I should go and see what these people are saying. Maybe I should go experience these conferences myself and make my own mind up and not just listen to these rumors. And then since then, I've been to the International Animal Rights Conference twice now. Been to conference in the USA, the AVA conference. We've just been to CARE conference over in Poland, and it's all been positive. It's all been fantastic. I've met amazing people, made amazing collaborations. I'm kicking myself that I listened to people all those years ago, that I didn't just go to these places myself and experience it for myself, because there's some elements of what they'd said, but it is by far the minority, like absolute tiny minority of people who are kind of behaving in those the ways of conflict. The vast majority of people that are open-minded, open to new ideas, they literally go to these conferences to get new ideas, which is something I didn't know. I thought it was an echo chamber. It's far from an echo chamber. These places are inviting lots of different speakers with lots of different topics, lots of different opinions, and they all get to go up there and be part of this. And so it's been a really nice learning experience for me, and a great example of how you shouldn't judge anyone or anything based on what other people say. You should go and check it out yourself, So
that was a great way of pretending you had not provoked a bunch of controversy, David.
Hey, well, we're going to get to it. We're coming to that.
That was a great acting job right now. I'm kidding.
No,
I'm
we're
sure
coming to it.
Complete good faith, but But let's get into the juicy stuff.
Well, that's the pretext. So what happened was so last year at the animal rights at this international animal rights conference in Luxembourg, I realized that actually, as it is a place, it's an open platform. And they seem to be open to different types of speakers, different topics. So I put myself forward as soon as they opened up for speakers and said, hey, I actually think I would like to come give a talk here. Seems like the best place for this talk, actually, because it's so many different people. It's not just like a hive mind. It's like different people, different opinions. And there'll be a lot of people there that this might be the first time they've ever heard somebody like me speak. Because maybe they don't follow people like me on social media. Maybe they don't, they're interested more in their own worlds and their own kind of circles. And so I applied to give a talk called The Number.
Nowadays, for the record. And that's one of the problems.
Yeah, right.
Even within a very small sub-community like veganism, everyone splits off into their little tiny sub-communities of the sub-community. And doesn't listen to anyone else. But anyway.
That includes me. And this is why it's been so eye-opening and honestly refreshing to come to these places and learn all these amazing things that I had no idea existed. Like some of the things people are doing, some of the activism that's going on, I had no idea it even existed. So it's been fantastic for me. And it's really inspired. So I thought, well, why don't I bring a new perspective then? I've learned new perspectives. Let me give something back. And so I applied to give a talk about vegan unity. I called it The Number One Threat to Vegan Unity. And to be completely honest, and I was honest about this in the beginning of the talk, it's a little bit of a spicy title, but realistically, I should have called it the best solutions for vegan unity, like how to promote vegan unity. That's pretty much what the talk I was giving. Now, I know you want to get to the controversy, but again, we gotta, without the context, it's even more controversial. So we need to give people the real feeling as to what happened there, so they can understand why there was some conflict. So basically, I started the presentation just explaining who I am and, where I come from. Which, by the way, a lot of people don't seem to know this. People assume that I'm middle or upper class because of the way I speak, but that's not true. I'm from a single parent on government welfare. So I wanted people to be aware of that. I want people to be aware of that now as well, that this whole concept of like, look at this privileged white man again coming in, giving his opinion. It's like, no, I literally grew up around heroin dealers and shit. Like I am not coming from that background. All right. So this, I wanted people to realize that these are opinions from me coming from this background and not some kind of, I'm not putting myself as some kind of authority or a scholar or some kind of, academic like you. I'm coming from there, and that's where most of my, lived experience comes from. And this whole presentation is just coming from experience in my life. It's not coming from a position of authority. So, and then we got into it, and I went into about, let's say 10 or 15% of the conflicts that I've personally experienced or that I have seen in my years of being an activist since 2017, right? And I say 10 to 15% because originally I had a list that was so long, it took about 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. So I had to cut it right down to about a couple of minutes. And this is just me talking about my experiences of conflict in this movement, which is unbelievable that I could talk about that for 30 minutes. There's so many of them. And I gave them all these examples. And obviously that kind of killed the room a little bit because it's depressing as hell. One of those examples that I gave, which was the one that was probably the most striking one for me, was when I first actually, is relevant to you as well, Wayne. When I first became an activist, I joined Anonymous for the Voiceless. Shortly after that, I started DxE in Barcelona. There was the first group, and I was like, yeah, let's do it. I'm inspired by these guys. This looks awesome. Let's do DxE. And this is when the first issues I faced started, when I got feedback from some people saying they're not going to come to my events, to these DxE events, not because they had an issue with you or DxE, not because they had an issue with the politics of DxE or whatever, or the strategy. The reason they weren't going to come is because this group was being led by a straight white male, me. And that is still to this day. I've tried racking my brain to think back before that, but I'm pretty sure that is the first time in my life that anyone has ever said, oh, I'm not going to work with you, or I'm not going to be your friend or whatever, because you are this skin color and this gender. Mm-hmm. Which, to face that in a movement where we're always talking about equality and justice, and it's wild to me that this is where it happened, and not some horrible racist in some, faraway country that hates white people or something. You know what I mean? Blew my mind. So I brought this up anyway, and as you can imagine, that bringing that up alone is controversial. And I explain how it made me feel unwelcome. I'd only been an activist for like 4 months. And like 4 months in, I'm being told that, oh, because you are this and this, then people are not going to support you. I was like, wow, that's a shocker. And
can I try and steal in the other perspective, though?
All right, yeah, go for it. Yeah,
I mean,
try to be charitable.
Was it really just that you're a straight white guy, or was it that they thought, look, there are people of color and women who are not getting opportunities, who, for whatever reason, the movement isn't welcoming, and let's try and be inclusive and make sure those folks are getting a shot too, before we immediately jump to the next straight white guy. Is that not a reasonable argument, or is that not what some of these people were saying?
I empathize with the attempts to promote equality of opportunity and between like people perceiving as if they don't have the opportunities. I empathize with that. In this specific case, there was a completely equal opportunity for somebody to launch DxE. I chose to do it. I stepped up to the mark and took that opportunity to do it because nobody else was. If they were, it would have already been started, right? It would have been founded already. Yep. So in other cases, I'd say you might have a case, and they might have a case in other situations. But I don't believe we fix this problem by tearing down the people who step up.
Yeah.
Right. I think that actually just causes another problem. You don't want to fix an issue of inequality by creating more inequality, because it's not like somebody like me deserves to be dragged down because they were born into this body they're born into. I did nothing wrong. You know what I mean? So there's a balance.
So I was steelmanning the other side because I agree with you, because I know how these DxE chapters got started more than anybody, because I co-founded the entire thing. And I'll say two things. One is, generally when DxE first started, there's literally one person who was willing to do it.
Right.
And I'm sure that was true in Barcelona, because no one knew who the hell we were. We're not like PETA or, Mercy for Animals. I mean, we're just some random ass group that's running around in grocery stores. But like, what the hell is that? These guys are weird.
Yeah, exactly.
So we got one person. We're lucky. But the second thing to point out about that is, leadership is not necessarily something that's a privilege. I mean, it sometimes is. I'm not saying there aren't times, but especially when you're an early organizer for DxE in a chapter that gets no money, that is often loathed by the rest of the animal rights movement, and certainly loathed by the government and the industry. I mean, people are coming after us, to destroy us and put us in jail. It's like, even if you think David's a more privileged person, then he should be the leader, because let's put the crosshairs on him rather than somebody else.
That's a good way.
A lot of times leadership is not a privilege, it's a sacrifice. And good leaders are willing to put themselves first. And I've seen you do this. I've seen you put yourself, not put yourself first, but put yourself first in line, not for power, but for sacrifice, to get targeted, to get attacked, to get brought down. And so, this terror about leadership on the left, and the notion that anyone who's stepping up in leadership to take on positions that are completely, they're not financially remunerative. It's not like you're getting rich out of this. They're not creating an enormous amount of social power. It's not like you're going out there and people in society are thinking like, oh, that's a DxE lead. Yeah. They're like, let's throw that guy in jail. Let's beat the crap out of this guy. So, and I'm not saying there aren't power dynamics that can develop, but to me, that criticism falls short because they don't understand just the sacrifices involved in grassroots leadership. So, but anyways,
right. No, it's a good point. It's a good point. And kind of on that, before we move on, I'll say there's the same issue when it comes to, people point out CEOs, right? So it's a really big, I suppose not a feminist talking point, but an equality talking point that across the board, because like with race politics, gender politics, there's not enough CEOs that are diverse, right? They point this out a lot, these individuals. But again, it's the same thing. It's what's often overlooked is that the CEO position in most companies is just horrible. It is like, I think about this job and I think about the money and the money sounds great. But have you seen what they have to do? Have you seen the kind of decisions they have to make? Have you seen how brutal and heartless and cold they have to be? I mean, they make decisions that literally cut people's money, that cut people's jobs. They make just life-changing decisions for so many people. That is not a job, and also the hours they have to work in a lot of cases, and the lack of family time and a lack of social time they have from. And this is not the all CEO positions, but it's a good majority of them. They require a lot more of you than any other job. And I just don't think many people would want that, despite the money, to be honest with you. Never mind whether they should get that. And I guess, I don't know, equal opportunity, I'm all on board for, but the idea that is a metric, that is how we measure the success of equality, is a really bad way to look at it, because I don't think the majority of people would survive that role. So it's a very specific minority of people that could perform that role. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm not sure I agree with you about CEOs, because I think a lot of people would love to be CEOs. I mean, the amount of money and influence you get, because if you're like the CEO of Apple or Google or something like that, everybody thinks you're awesome. But you're missing my point, though. You're missing my point, though. Everyone loves the idea of being a CEO.
Yeah,
but the job is a lot harder. I agree with that.
Yeah,
the job is a lot harder than most people think. But there are a lot of people who are willing to endure that and would love to take that job, notwithstanding the sacrifices.
They'd last like 5 minutes. Most people who would love the job, I'm telling you, they would last 5 minutes before the stakeholders and the shareholders were like, get them the hell out of here. They cannot cut it.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, so you sent me I don't want to jump into this too much.
No, we'll go. Yeah, I know. This was a side point. It was a side point. No, we can.
And you sent me your thoughts on this, your notes on your talk beforehand.
Yeah.
And there were some points of disagreement. I think, for example, I'm just talking about my experience of Chinese
Could I say
people.
before we get to that, though, because this is because you know what we're talking about, but they don't, and I want to just like
continue.
Fine. Before we go into the so where were we anyway? So we were talking about okay, that example of DxE and how I got
leadership role,
and that Chris,
you're a white guy. We're not going to
exactly. Exactly. So I gave the rest of the talk basically, and I think it wasn't very controversial, to be honest with you. The rest of my talk up until the point where it was, but ultimately I gave a few examples that included. I also gave other examples of people misunderstanding me, misinterpreting me, and that becoming an issue. But we don't need to get into that. It's we'll focus on this point. And I gave some statistics and some data about how this is affecting us. With We the Free, they provided some data about how the vast majority of activists are actually going through burnout and mental health issues because of these types of conflicts. And actually, a lot of people have left the movement citing this specific type of conflict as a reason, which is obviously just ridiculous considering how much of a small group we are in society. That it's phenomenal that we would tolerate people leaving over this kind of thing without looking to fix it. So, and I went into how to fix it. So I went into couple of steps. So my steps, I'm going to briefly go over this so we can get to the conflicts. I know that's what you really want. The steps.
Can I actually ask, before you go into the steps, what do you mean by this type of conflict? Do you mean a conflict related to identity politics, related to kind of...
No. I mean conflict as in where people disagree on something, and instead of looking to understand each other and kind of just like, okay, let's just keep plugging away because we know at the end of the day we're in it for the same reason. They completely go off and actually like, no, that person is evil. And then it just escalates, that kind of conflict. So race could be about race, could be about gender, could be about their opinions on a certain comedian. It could be about politics. Yeah,
could be about Gaza.
That's one that's obviously tearing people apart right now. But just this inability to...
I'm laughing not because Gaza is something to laugh at, for the record, because David and I talked about how we're probably not going to jump into the substance of the Gaza conflict because it's so tense. But anyways. Yeah.
Well, we're not qualified to give some kind of authoritative opinion on it. Yeah. But I went through these steps to unify the movement. So basically, my ideas were to firstly focus on the fundamental important things we agree on and not on the things we disagree on as a priority. Tolerate disagreements, actually, and don't see them as just evil. Just like, okay, that's I don't agree with you there. Just you could move on. My third step was to actually look at disagreements as a chance to learn and grow. So see a disagreement as a type of challenge. They go, oh, that's going to help me either confirm what I already believe because I'm gonna try and debunk them, or it could alter and maybe nudge me slightly towards their side. Maybe, who knows? It's exciting. Be excited about it. Either way, it's a win. Either way, you either find out you were wrong or you prove you were right. That's a win-win. If the other person agrees to do the same, isn't that a fantastic situation that we have on our hands, right? I also talked about making contact without judgment. I used the example of Daryl Davis, who was a black man who spent time with members of the KKK in order to convince them to leave the KKK. And his main thing was making contact without judging them. That was his main thing that worked with them. Because obviously if you start judging people, then it just becomes that they expect that, right? So it almost kind of diffuse the situation when he was actually just interested in listening and helped them open up and be able to have the discussions that needed to be had. And then the final final point I gave, it is a challenge, was to actually, 1 minute, I don't remember what my final point was. I think we finished it more or less around there, actually. Oh, that was it. Using first principles thinking. That was the fifth step. So that was basically the idea, and is basically the idea of when you take a problem, you take a situation, instead of just going into it with all the assumptions intact, you strip it down to everything that you know, and you forget everything else. So say you come to me, Wayne, and you say, hey, I don't like this guy. I want him to be, you wouldn't say this, but I want him to be punished. He's a horrible, dirty racist. I hate him. And I say, okay, that's your assumption, right? Great. Okay, let's look at the evidence then. Let's look at what actually has happened. Show me what he's done. Tell me what he's done. So say you show me a Facebook post, right? And that's it. Okay, great. So anything else that you've said, your feelings, that's not what I'm going to bring up with this person. I'm going to focus on the Facebook post because that is the thing that we have. That is the one thing we know. Let's delve deep into this Facebook post. And then you sit down with them and, okay, what did this mean? What were you trying to say? What are your intentions? And you work there instead of working on someone's assumptions based on their feelings. You know what I mean? Strip it right back to its core, basically. And that was the step 5. And then the controversy, now we can get into it. So this is basically the whole talk. And it was just coming from a place of like, let's just figure out how we can keep working together despite disagreeing, because we need to. Animals need us to. We're such a minority. So I used the issue of the kind of the white male thing from earlier on, and I spoke about how we would benefit from applying some. We would benefit from applying some, I suppose, critical thinking to our emotional points, because we're very emotional people in this movement. That's why we're in this movement, right? Let's just be. I mean, you're a very logical person, and you're obviously very intelligent, but you admit you're also quite. David. Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But you're also emotional. I
aspire to be, but you know.
But you're emotional too, right? And that's what drives you forward. Is what drives most of us forward. I mean, pure logic isn't enough to keep us fighting this fight. No, oh my God, you know, we need to have the feeling that like this is injustice. If we drive forward that fire. And unfortunately, sometimes we let the fire take over too much. And in these situations, that's what I think we're doing most of the time. So I pointed this out on the stage and I said, look, we have this perception, and I empathize with this. I empathize with wanting more equality and have more equality of opportunity so that people are able to, get into roles and be in positions that they want to be in, and that there's no kind of holding them back, and I empathize with this. But I also wanted to point out that when we look closer at some of the key organizations in our movement, and I brought up a list, the Animal Save Movement, PETA, Viva, DxE, Animal Rebellion, Animal Justice Project, and ProVeg, all of these organizations were either founded by or are currently directed by women, or in your case, people of color. Yeah. And these are the most influential groups probably in the entire movement. And it wasn't a gotcha, it was I understand that there are some issues, but wow, how cool is that? Right? Yeah. I mean, how that is a great picture of our movement, is it not? And it's actually not the case in wider society, but it seems like we're doing a pretty damn good job in our little pocket of the world so far. I also pointed out that with the most prominent online activists, like this Earthling Ed Joey Carbstrong, for example, some might argue that there's not enough contribution from other diverse people in that world, but they completely overlook that the most successful vegan and plant-based like adjacent accounts on the internet are plant-based recipe, food blogs, lifestyle vlogs, and they are getting so much more success than both Joey, Ed, me, you, all of us combined. We're talking hundreds of millions of views on the regular, and this area of YouTube is dominated by women and people of color, like completely dominated. So that's really cool to note. It's just worth noting. It's just something like, how cool is that, right? That's not all negative. Actually, there's some really good wins here for those individuals who are really concerned about this. Like, look at some good things. And then there's one more point I made, that it's also worth noting that in Europe and the West in general, our demographic makeup is a majority of white people and about a 50-50 gender balance. So we are going to see the results of that in our movement. We're going to see that there will be probably a white dominant presence in our movement, because we're in this part of the world, at least, because we're in part of the world where it is mostly white people. And there'll be about roughly maybe 50-50 split, if not, it's probably more leans towards women in our movement, to be honest with you. I think there's more women than men across the board. And so I wanted to bring this up to recognize that there are like lots of diverse contributions, and we shouldn't allow any misconceptions to obscure that, because actually we do have some really good wins there, and it is actually a really good situation. And this is the bit that I think was the bit that I think so. I mean, I don't know. A lot of people said they really enjoyed the talk and they really appreciated that bit specifically because they had also felt these kinds of hostilities and they didn't feel like it was deserved. But the only question that came up was kind of linked with race that was a bit confrontational. So I feel that maybe this was the point that maybe a few people felt a bit uncomfortable. And
yeah, which I can understand that controversy, because I think you're wrong about race, but but I also love you. And I think this is a good opportunity to kind of practice some of the principles, because I think the principles you describe are completely valid. I mean, it's extremely sound to think about these disagreements as an opportunity to learn, to engage without judgment. Because I have no doubt that whatever your beliefs on whether people of color are given the same opportunities as white people, that you're coming from a good place, that you've sacrificed so much for a marginalized community that I care about more than any community in the world, even my own community, non-human animals, right? I'm not a non-human animal, but I've seen what happens to them and whatever experiences I've been through. And I don't know if you know this about me. I've been through some pretty awful experiences as a Chinese person. I got my face sliced open as a kid, got sent to the ER by someone calling me an ugly chink. So there's definitely racism in this country that I've borne the brunt of. And to be blunt, I have experienced that in the animal rights movement too, like really intense experiences of racism. Chinese people are not the most popular people in the animal rights movement. There's a lot of footage of Chinese people doing god awful things that are totally unacceptable and disgusting, and in particular doing things to dogs, which if you want to get animal rights activists mad, show them someone doing something to a dog and they will come after you. Yeah, but the point isn't so much whether I'm correct or you're correct. It's like, to me, one of the reasons I want to have this conversation is because I think it's really important to have these conversations in a way that shows that we can still work together and come to a place where we're learning from each other about various experiences. Because, like, I don't have the experience of being targeted by, like, for lack of a better term, a woke mob because I'm white, because I'm not white. That's just not an experience I've had. You've also never had the experience of having someone scream during a talk that you're giving that the Chinese are the problem. And that has happened to me. Like, I think I told you about this. I was giving a speech at a march, an elephant march, right? It was a march for elephants and rhinos. And I was invited to speak. And I talked about the activism I had just done in China, and the Chinese activists who in some cases were risking their lives, to protect elephants, because China's a dangerous place to do activism. It's like, it's not like the United States and Europe. I mean, people get thrown in jail for decades. They get killed by the government in ways that we don't even understand. And one of the people's response while I'm giving this talk is just to scream at me and interrupt me and say, "Tell the truth, the Chinese are the problem." And I'm like, dude, I'm Chinese. There are definitely some Chinese people are the problem, but it's not, you can't say the Chinese are the problem, because there are a lot of us risking a lot to try and help elephants. And yeah, I mean, honestly, my experience in the animal rights movement is, from day one, it was like extremely difficult to get anyone to take me seriously. And I had like a lot of credentials that I've seen white people had the same credentials that I had, who went to MIT. I was a law professor at one of the top 10 law schools in the country. And I've seen people with similar backgrounds just be welcomed. And like, everyone's like, "Oh my God, we want to get this guy involved." And for me, it was just the exact opposite. There was so much Like, I think for the first couple of years I was doing grassroots animal rights activism, a lot of people, including people who ultimately became my close friends and confided in me about this and said, everyone just thought you were an infiltrator because we had never seen someone like you before. And we just assumed this guy has to be a plant. He's working for the Chinese government. He's trying to figure out what's going on with animal rights activists so he can undermine the movement. I was like, dude, I was like the hardest worker. I was coming to every single demo, doing everything I could. And everyone just thought I was an infiltrator.
I think if, just to make a non-serious point, but I could totally see you as a narc. Like if you started turning up, if you started turning up to my events in the shirt and the glasses
I know.
And just like really intelligent, sounding really intelligent and like about how you're like really smart and a lawyer, I'd be like, this dude is like, no way. Like, I don't know.
There's other aspects of my weirdness that make that reasonable. But if it were just my experience, I'd say, okay, maybe it's just my experience and maybe I'm being a little sensitive. But there's also a lot of evidence that, systemic racism is a real thing. So I'll give you one concrete example. So there's this study by a right-wing economist, this guy named John List at the University of Chicago. He's super right-wing, and he's going to win the Nobel Prize one day. He's one of the most prominent economists in the world. And he actually went into this study. He was going to study racism and systemic racism. And he went into the study partly because he thought, I want to prove that a lot of this implicit bias stuff, this stuff people say like, oh, people don't have equal opportunity is sort of nonsense. That when you go into the real world, that's not happening. And the way he did this is he got this huge data set from Lyft, so the ride sharing company.
Right.
And I think Lyft is not as big in Europe. Is that right?
No,
you guys have mostly Uber. Okay.
Uber
so
and
Lyft,
Bolt.
Lyft is sort of like the progressive alternative to Uber. Like Uber's more dominant, it's more capitalist, more right-wing. And Lyft, they're like kind of quirky, and it's big in places like San Francisco, New York City. So it's already like a more progressive app that is used in more progressive places. So if anything, you'd think there'd be less racism in places where they're using Lyft a lot, right? But the way he studied this is he looked at all the data, and Lyft has this amazing data set where they can track basically every car, the speed at which it's going, the exact location it is in, and even the make and model. And so he had, I think it was like hundreds of billions of data points, this economist. And he said, I want to look at whether there's a difference in whether people get traffic tickets and other violations, just purely based on race. And he could control for everything else. Like you could look at exactly the same street corner, exactly the same time of day, and they can track exactly the speed the car is driving and figure out how much difference race makes, And what do you think he found?
There's probably some kind of bias towards people of color. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was big. So there was a 30% difference in both. You could have exactly the same car, exactly the same speed, exactly the same location. And if you run that like 1,000 times, people of color were getting ticketed about 30% more, which is big. That was like much bigger than they expected. And when they got a ticket, they were getting 30% more severe tickets, right? So it's not only they're more likely to get ticketed, they're paying 30% more. And that is a tax. And that's just like street level traffic enforcement. Like my experience has been in leadership positions, it is even harder because the amount of scrutiny and the amount of just intuitive trust you need to build in people as a leader determines so much of your success. It's the sad thing is there's this thing called rational discrimination. Have you heard of this?
No.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example to illustrate this. When I was a lawyer at a law firm in Chicago, and I was, I think by the law firm's own kind of performance system, I was considered a star associate. Like I'm not tooting my own horn, but they gave me like the largest bonus in my entire class. Like I got a $35,000 bonus in my first year. They were like super happy with the work. That was just my bonus, and this is way before. Now I'm super poor because I lost all my money. Back then, I was making $200K and getting $35,000 bonuses as a securities litigator. And I worked super hard. I think I was really good at my job. I did everything that my clients asked me to do. And I had a conversation with a client once. So we had a client who was an executive at a very large company in Chicago. And he was just chatting me up and asking me like, oh, how are things going? It seems like you're doing a really good job. And I was like the star associate on his case. Like he knew me because he saw the work I was doing and he knew I was doing an exceptional job. And again, I had been awarded the highest bonus at the firm that year. And I said to him, honestly, like I got into this thinking, I just want to try this out, because I basically went to work for this firm because I ran out of money. After law school, I started all these animal rights organizations. I sucked at everything I was doing. I was not accomplishing anything. So I actually ran out of money and had to start working at a law firm the idea behind it initially was I want to make a bunch of money and then start more animal rights organizations. And the fastest way for me to do that was to work at a big firm. And so I said, I got into this not thinking this is going to be a permanent thing, because I just thought I'm going to try this out. And I'm really enjoying it. And honestly, I'm thinking maybe I should try and become a partner someday, because I can make so much money and, give so much money to the things I care about. I didn't tell him that I was a vegan and animal rights person, but that's what I was thinking in my head. But honestly, I'm thinking now maybe I stick around and this is the way I can contribute to the world. And one of the things he said to me was basically like, hey, I just want to I'm trying to be honest with you. I'll never hire a Chinese guy to run one of my cases. And it's not because I'm racist. It's because I know there are enough people out there who are just going to see you and say, and I've never seen a Chinese lawyer before. This is kind of weird. That if I'm betting my company before a jury of 12 peers, just 12 random people in the city of Chicago, I'm not going to bet my money on a Chinese guy. And I'm just trying to be straight with you that your odds of getting to the partnership level where you're actually arguing like a multi-billion-dollar case in front of a jury are just very low. And I'm not trying, because the guy I was talking to was actually Jewish. So he was a progressive. He wasn't trying to be an asshole. He was just trying to give me straightforward advice. Yeah. And then I looked at kind of the law firm and I realized there were basically 0 partners who were East Asian. There were like 0, not 1, not 2. And I'm thinking to myself, like, there's so many associates at my level, at the low level, there are a ton of associates who are super hardworking. Again, I don't think anyone at that firm would say, like, anyone who knows me and knows how I work knows I'm like among the hardest working people at every organization I've been to. I mean, arguably the hardest working person. I think most people have said like he's reasonably competent too. I mean, and again, by metrics, you look at kind of the metrics of like performance bonuses, whatever it is, like I've done pretty well. But every organization I've been a part of, whether it's the academy, law firms, even the animal rights movement, like I look at the animal rights movement, the Asian community in the United States is the fastest growing minority community in the country. It's about 5% of the country. This country, unlike Europe, I think our percentage of people of color is much higher. It's 40% of the entire American population is people of color. And especially in like the mainstream animal rights organizations. And I'm not saying this is because anyone is like intentionally racist. But I do think there are opportunities that are being denied people of color. You just don't see anyone who's a person of color. And like you sent me a list of organizations led by various people, and I will know there was only one person of color, and that was me. You know, and I mean, honestly, if you just ask yourselves right now, can you think of any person of color leading a prominent animal rights organization?
Not in the West, no, but in other countries, yeah, in other countries.
But again, in the United States, 40% of people are people of color. Like, so we should see if things, and again, there might be cultural differences that lead some groups to become, more motivated or more prone to leadership. I think in East Asian culture, for example, part of the reason is because, our culture is just not one. I'm a very unusual East Asian guy in the sense that like we very much encourage like being quiet and silent and deferential to authority. And that's like kind of inconsistent with the need to rise up and become a leader. But I still think, I can't speak of gender and other things, but I think there are a lot of problems. And it's just, and I'm not saying like, I told you this, I'm not an animal rights activist to promote the cause of people of color. I'm here to promote the cause of animals. And I hate it. I hate it. And as a person of color, I hope people listen to this. I hate it when people use POC issues to distract from the animals, because the animals don't have a space at the table. Like they are the ones who never get heard at all. Like even if my voice or the leadership of people of color is not heard enough in animal rights circles, and I think that probably is the case, the animals never get a seat at all. We never hear them. And it is, the example I give is like, even if you think cancer and heart disease are both problems. So you got 2 rooms. One is like the cardiac wing, or one is the cardiac wing and the other is a cancer wing. You don't run into the cancer wing in the hospital and start screaming, people are having heart attacks. Come on, guys. In the same way, even if you think racism and animal abuse are equal problems, and they're not. I'll say this right now as a person of color. My view is whatever problems we have with racism, they are tiny compared to the problems we have with animals. Because what happens to animals is an atrocity upon atrocities. It's unbelievable. you know, I am so blessed. Even having had my face sliced open as a kid, being told I was an ugly chink, getting sent to the hospital, I am blessed to be a Chinese person in the United States. I'm blessed to have that experience compared to any non-human animal in a slaughterhouse or a factory farm, right? But even if you did think they were equivalent problems, it's a super shitty thing for people of color to come into the animal rights space and say, me, 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 me. Like, and that's true even if you've got a good complaint, right? Because this is a space first and foremost for the animals and for us to center their experience. And so for that reason alone, I think it's unethical. And I think it's also non-strategic for people of color to try and dominate these spaces and say, you have to pay attention to our issues first. And maybe I have some privilege in that regard too, because I do think, like, you know, obviously the experience of a Chinese person is very different from the experience of a Black person. And also as a Chinese person, I've had some really shitty experiences, but I'm also like very well educated. I was very lucky. Unlike you, my parents were not middle class. You know, they were pretty upper class because they got rich pretty quickly. And my dad was a very successful scientist at a very big pharmaceutical company. But yeah, I don't know. So it's, sorry, I just went on a little diatribe, but
yeah,
do you have any,
it's all good.
Thoughts on any of that?
Well, my first and foremost thought is that I wish you wouldn't have framed that entire lengthy, really quite sad point with the basis of, here's why I disagree with you, acting as if I disagree with everything you just said. I really wish you'd have framed it as, well, here's my opinion, because now anyone listening to this is going to be like, David's evil. There's this poor Wayne.
I agree completely.
I'm semi-joking. It's just the way it was framed, as if I disagree with everything you just said, and like I don't at all. And there's no part, in my opinion, there's no part of the things I said in this talk that contest with everything you've just said. And I'll explain why. So firstly, the things you discussed about being cut is horrific. And, you know, it's that, just want to say that's a horrible story. Also, I find it, to be honest, physical harm is obviously horrific, but I find the psychological harm also to be quite horrific. Of you standing on a stage and someone shouting at you about just because you're Chinese. I mean, at least the cut heals pretty quickly. I mean, that kind of thing, that can put you off ever standing on a stage ever again for anxiety. And so that also is horrible. Like, I don't wish either of those things on anybody. And it's horrible that you had to go through them. And I totally agree with you that there is. So we talk about the animal rights movement and this animosity towards Chinese people. I think I've seen it too. And it tends to be a certain demographic. And I might offend some people here, but I just say it as it is, right? It tends to be a certain demographic, and I'm not hating on them. I'm just explaining who they are. Usually middle-aged women on Facebook. I haven't really seen it in many other places. And edgy little kids, but that they're not usually vegans. Like edgy kids will come along on Instagram or whatever, and TikTok, and be like, yeah, exactly right. Yeah. But the ones who genuinely mean it and they're animal rights people, they do tend to fall into that same category.
There was a middle-aged white woman who screamed at me, the Chinese are the problem.
There you go. There you go. Right. There you go. And it is a problem for sure that there's but I think that's more of an issue with society as opposed to the animal rights movement. I think actually a lot of people in society have that belief. And if they become vegan, some of them hold on to that belief, and that is a problem. But I think as a movement, we don't stand for that. Like, as a movement, if I was to describe the movement, in your SAVE movement, all these organizations I said earlier, not one of them would tolerate that. They would all come together and unify and say, this is absolutely unacceptable. And I'm happy they say that. The most key people in the movement and the most key organizations in our movement would condemn the hell out of that. They would pull that person in. Some of them would actually take what I think is the wrong decision and eject that person and tell them never come back again. I think that's a mistake. I think that person needs to be brought in, sit down and say, look, here's why what you said is offensive. And you can't just shout things about China because he's Chinese. He's here in America. He's Chinese American, and it's got nothing to do with him. Now, he happens to be talking about an issue that might involve something with China, but there's a better way of explaining that. There's a better way to say, hey, look, hello, sir. As a Chinese man, do you think that China is a problem? And how would you solve it? That's a much better way And I don't think that's you might still find that offensive because it's like, oh, just because I'm Chinese, she brings up China, but it's more understandable at least, right? Than
right.
just screaming something at you. So I think I condemn all of these cases, but well, I guess what point
I
I'm
want to say
making
something else an addendum to that, though. It's also on
yeah.
me to not respond with hate towards the person who's saying it, even something as extreme as that.
Right.
And I will tell you, that person ultimately became my friend. And there was
Right,
another
yeah.
woman who was not as aggressive, but came to me quietly after a talk I gave once and said basically the same thing. You know, there's actually another middle-aged white woman who came to me after a talk I gave about the dog meat trade and said,
Right.
you know, I just want to confess to you, and I'm trying not to be racist, but I've seen a lot of animal abuse by a lot of people, but there seems like there's something wrong with Chinese people. I just want to say that's the way I feel. There's something wrong with Chinese people. And there's something wrong with that culture. And I said, yeah, I hear that. You know, I'm sorry that you feel that way. And I can understand that given you see these dogs being killed and, you know, it's extremely upsetting. And I said, and what I want to tell you right now is that I would not have been able to save, like I risked my life. I got the shit beat out of me twice, not just once, got charged with espionage, saving 3 dogs. And a lot of people said like, oh my God, Wayne, thank you so much for what you're doing. And I told her, I want you to know that there were dozens of Chinese people who don't get the same plaudits that I get, who helped me with that. And who in many ways risk more than I did. Because when you're in China and you're working with the activists, again, it's a lot more dangerous. I had the entire US government helping me. When I got arrested, the US embassy got involved and said, this is an international incident. You need to let this guy go. These people in China who are doing this sort of work, they don't have the US government to support them. They get evicted, they get jailed, they get blacklisted in ways we can't even comprehend. And so what I explained to her is it's not about Chinese people per se. It's about a system of abuse that frankly exists in all countries. It's not just in the United States. We don't call them dogs in this country, but we take sentient animals like pigs that are just as intelligent as dogs and subject them to torture far beyond anything that's happening in China. Because when I first started doing these investigations in China, factory farming wasn't even really a thing. They didn't have these huge industrial slaughterhouses. It was the United States that exported factory farming to China. And over a couple of years, partly because I didn't just immediately assume this is a bad person. I wanted to understand the disagreement. And maybe even there's some truth to it. I think there's maybe some truth. I do think to the extent Chinese culture does not appreciate the dog as a beautiful, amazing, sentient being that should be a member of our families, Chinese culture is bad. I agree with that. You know, in the same way that I think American culture is bad to the extent it does not believe that pigs are beautiful, amazing, sentient beings that can be part of our family. And so we can say both of those things are true. But instead, but the key thing for me is I had to control my emotions and say, you're not just a scumbag. You're not a hateful person. You're here because you care about suffering. And you're even willing to talk to me as a Chinese person about this. And this individual ended up becoming a very good friend of mine. And I'm still very good friends with her to this day, you know, and she actually apologized to me a couple of years later and said like, you know what, I remember I told you this thing. And now that I've met you and Wilson and all these other Chinese activists, I realized I was wrong. They're good people from all cultures, you know?
And I think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of people would be telling me right now, why should I, as a person of color, have to mind my temper like you have done? And why should I do that? Why do I have to be the one to do this? And I want to acknowledge now that the fact that you did this, it's not like it shouldn't go as an unthanked thing. It should be like you know, you did a great thing there. Instead of allowing your being offended and your emotions to get the better of you, you controlled them to get an outcome that was significantly better, not just for you or her, but for the movement. And you were able to actually, and you're not always going to be able to do that. It's not like we all can be perfect all the time, but what a goal to aim for, right? When someone says something that you find offensive or potentially racist, instead of flipping on them, telling the seniors, I want them out, whoever the senior is in your organization, putting a story up about them, tweeting about them, trying to ruin their life. How much better of a movement could we create if we all tried to do what you did and said, look, you know what? Let's see if you actually are this evil person you appear to be right now, because you're coming off as that. And I'm convinced that 8 or 9 times out of 10, it is not the case that they're evil. It's the case that they just don't realize what they're saying and they don't fully grasp how it makes you feel. And that's something we can work with. That's something we should be able to work with, or we should at least try to work with, surely, instead of just expelling them immediately. We can't afford to do that as a movement, can we? We can't afford to just expel people like that on a whim.
You're being more charitable than I think you should be towards people of color react negatively. And maybe you have to be because you're a white person, but I'm Chinese, so I can speak at least on behalf of Chinese people and say, I can understand people overreacting. I've overreacted at times, like, so for example, when I got my face sliced open by a kid who assaulted me after football practice. So he had some sort of like bladed thing on his finger and he sucker punched me in the back of the head, cut my back of the head open, punched me a few times in the face. 100% overreacted. I started wailing on the guy.
Obviously, man.
Well,
that's understandable.
I overreacted to the point that I started seriously hurting this guy. Like, because I was actually
who could blame you?
And
who could blame you?
Is, we could have a disagreement about nonviolence too, but
I mean, this is adrenaline. This is different, man. This is self-defense.
Yeah,
this is not
even then. I mean,
oof.
So what happens?
It's a lot. I'm sorry. I'm not justifying you being violent. I'm saying like I understand here in this case, you've just been sliced open. I understand why you would flip out. That's what I'm saying.
And I started wailing on the guy, and I'm holding him down, like punching him in the face. And when the coaches came out and everyone split us apart, I mean, clearly they knew I had been hurt because I had like blood all over my face and had to be brought to the ER to get stitched back up. But I mean, the kid underneath me was getting wailed on, and he was basically not a threat at that point, and I was still wailing on him,
Right.
And that wasn't okay. That was totally wrong for me. And whatever we think about people in society at large, doing what they do when they are hurt or offended or even physically assaulted, if you are an activist, you have a higher obligation to represent the animals and the movement you believe in. And for me as a person of color, that means anti-racism. Like, one of the beauties of King was, even in the face of violence and repression, far beyond what any animal rights activist has faced probably to date. I mean, there are activists who've gone to jail. Some activists have been killed even, right? You look at kind of the woman, I'm totally forgetting her name, in the Save movement in Toronto who got hit by a truck, or Jill Phipps, another woman in the UK. Do you know Jill's story?
I know Jill. It's Regan Russell.
Yeah, Regan Russell, of course. So there are people who have been killed, but compared to the civil rights movement, where their homes being firebombed, people being assassinated, I mean, King died. He died, you know. But even in the face of that sort of violence, the civil rights movement was effective, and the activists made a promise to themselves and their cause that we will not respond with hate. Like, we will respond with love. We take your hate, we transform into love. And that's why they won people over. And so while you're right that, look, sometimes you're going to be a little out of control, and we can understand you reacting negatively when someone says something like the Chinese are a problem and interrupts your talk. We're activists. Our goal is not just to live in the world and be safe for ourselves. We are trying to change the world, right? And if you're trying to change the world, then you have to have control over your own emotions. And it is your obligation, including as a person of color who's going to deal with racism, including as an LGBT person who might deal with homophobia, transphobia. It is your obligation to harness your own emotions, decenter yourself, and think about what's best for the world. And that's controversial. And it's easier for me to say in the context of race, right? Because I'm a person of color, and easiest for me to say in the context of Chinese people, because I am a Chinese person and I have experienced anti-Chinese racism. But even for me and in my personal identity, it is extremely important for me not to respond with just emotion. So this idea that people shouldn't be tone policed, for example, is to me, and apologies if anyone thinks this is controversial, but to me it is nonsense. It is not. You absolutely should be tone police. We police tone in all regards. If you are trying to be persuasive, then you have to think about your tone. And And I'm not saying this is true of people at large. Like, if you don't want to be activists and you're just trying to create a safe little bubble for yourself, then by all means, don't be tone policed. But if you're trying to be an effective activist, you 100% should be tone policing yourself. You have to tone police yourself, or you will not create the change you want. And this guy, Daryl, what's his last name again? Daryl.
Who are we talking about?
The black guy who goes to work with Nazis.
Daryl Davis.
Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a great example. I am sure he is tone policing himself because he's around KKK members. Yeah,
probably.
If he didn't tone police, I mean, he'd just be wailing on everybody. He'd be like, "You're a scumbag. You're a racist. You're a KKK member. I'm going to beat the crap out of all of you." But he's learned to harness those emotions and say, "All right, what is the productive thing? What is the thing that's most likely to create change?" And that is what activists have to do. So, I
And
mean,
the beauty,
that's my take.
the beauty is that in the vast majority of cases, you're not going to have to be Daryl Davis when you're talking to another activist, because they're not going to hate you and who you are. It's going to be a complete misunderstanding. But actually, with the tone policing and the Daryl Davis style, bringing that to meat eaters, that's a very good idea, actually, to look for whatever's going to be the best, and rather than what's going to make you feel the best. And that's another topic for another day, but that's something I've been really trying to work on. I have two things to comment on that. You know, when you were saying earlier that on the stage, you know, when the lady shouted that at you, and obviously you get upset and then you control it. And but sometimes we were saying that sometimes we can't control it. I completely empathize with that. Even though I'm not a person of color and I've never had to experience that on a big scale, it has happened to me a lot within this movement. And actually, within our movement specifically, it is tolerated. I'm going to say something on record here. It appears to be the only form of traditional racism, as in the old dictionary definition, that is tolerated in our movement, is racism against white people. That seems to be very well tolerated and actually kind of the norm, or discrimination, or whatever you want to call it. I know there's lots of terms people use because they don't like to call it racism. So I've experienced that, and that pissed me off so much that I overreacted. And that's even coming from me, somebody who is, do you know what I'm trying to say? So what I'm saying is, I understand if you're a Chinese person or you're a person of color from somewhere else. I understand if you overreact or have a big reaction, because even I've only faced 5% possibly of what you faced, and I overreacted. So I totally get it. I mean, I totally understand it. Like, even though I can't understand what it's like to be you, I totally get why some people find it hard to control themselves. But it's worth trying. That's my point here. It's worth trying. And I can never understand how really, truly difficult it is for somebody, you know, who's in that position. The other thing I wanted to mention, just on that other thing you said there, you were talking about how much it absolutely is worth it to control ourselves, and we have an obligation to control ourselves. We have an obligation to be the best we can be. And I agree with you. I think that's a really good message. It doesn't even just apply to this specific case. It applies to literally all the activism we do, and I think it's a great message. I got into a discussion after my talk, and I made these really funny, actually, almost the same points you've just made. I said like almost identical to this guy in public. A big crowd formed around us because obviously it's spicy, so people want to listen in. And this guy, I was telling this guy, like, yeah, you know, like everything you just said, almost word for word, which is why I was sat here nodding like, holy shit, like, were you there? Were you there listening in? This is amazing. And then he said, okay, he said, that's fine. But what about if
wouldn't that be funny if that guy was me in disguise?
Oh, I know, right? Hilarious.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. I wasn't there. Don't worry. But I'm not stealing your ideas and passing them off as my own.
But it was. I don't know. It's good to me. It's good to know that you know there are people on the same exact wavelength, and it's cool that we got there even with. Well, you thought we disagreed, but we don't disagree at all, by the way. We're completely in agreement.
We probably do disagree about some things, but we'll talk about that later. That's okay. I think that's
on this topic. Thing. On this topic, I don't think so.
I like even so. I mean, even the idea that racism against people of color is condemned. Nobody condemned this woman for screaming at me that the Chinese are the problem. For the record,
interesting.
You know, and also think that
what event was this?
Sort of explicit. Huh? What's that?
What was the event?
It was a march for elephants and rhinos in San Francisco, and this is not some conservative city.
Oh, okay. Was this was this like one of those kind of was it a non-vegan animal rights event?
No, it wasn't a vegan march. Yeah.
So it's totally.
So there were a lot of like middle-aged white women there.
Right. Yeah. This is, I honestly, dude, I wouldn't.
And I think honestly, a lot of them were like kind of weirded out that there was even a Chinese guy speaking. They're like, why is there a Chinese guy speaking about this? We've been talking about how elephants and rhinos are being killed by the Chinese for this entire march. And then they pull out this Chinese guy. So everyone was already like a little weirded out, I think.
Oh, God. Let me just clarify here on that. I when I'm referring to the animal rights movement, I'm referring to the actual animal rights movement, not these kind of...
Even within the animal rights movement, I mean, I don't want to interrupt you because I want you to continue your story, but
all right.
I think they're more subtle. I'll just give you a concrete example. I think the reason there's so many cult allegations against DxE is partly, I don't think entirely, but partly because I'm Chinese. And the other major cult allegation that's made in the animal rights movement, do you know what the other cult allegation is? Have you heard of the Loving Hut?
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone calls them a cult in the United States.
Right.
There was even a big veg news. There was a front page story. This is the most prominent vegan restaurant in the world. There are more vegan restaurants. The leader of the Loving Hut, Supreme Master Ching Hai. I mean, it's a stupid name, Supreme Master, but it's a translation of terms. Like it's like Reverend, basically, right?
Yeah,
but
sure.
There was a cover story in Veg News about how Loving Hut is a cult with virtually no evidence behind it and virtually no interrogation of the actual people who run the organization. And I have no doubt there are problems at the Loving Hut, just like there are problems with every organization. But the idea that we should be going after this organization that's created the largest vegan restaurant chain in the world.
Yeah, I'm laughing because it's so crazy. But sorry, continue. I'm not laughing at you. Yeah.
It's okay if you were laughing at me too. but there is, and there's just so much evidence that there's an implicit distrust in people who are different from us. In any way, like even, and I do think, I think a lot of the reason that DxE has faced a lot of the problems it's faced is because I was Chinese and Korea's Indian. And
all right, so for Loving, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. For Loving Hut, I heard the same thing. I think it always seemed a bit weird with the TV and the TV channel they have and stuff. But I don't know why it's a cult. With DxE, look, all right. You might be right. Wayne, you might be right. Okay, you might be right. Maybe it's because you're Chinese and Priya's Indian. It could be that. Or it could also be, Wayne, it could also be for the same reasons that people call vegans a cult. Because when you have a lot of people that dress very similar, that believe the same thing, people start to wonder if it's a cult. At DxE, you all wear the same blue t-shirts. You guys live together. Remember that? And there was all these... Oh, come on. There was all these stories coming out, man.
In the Bay Area... Like, so we had one house that had like 7 people, all of whom were friends, and some of whom were dating each other. Like Chris and Almira were married, and in the Bay Area, the average apartment in San Francisco is $3,500 a month.
I get it. I get it.
To live, I get it. To live by myself, but I gave all my money to animals. So,
I'm not like agreeing with the cult people who say I made a comedy video. Do you remember the comedy video I made? Did you see that?
No, tell.
I did a skit. I did a sketch, and DxE was in it. I was doing different types of vegans, and one of my sketches was me wearing a DxE t-shirt, and I was mocking you guys playfully, saying like, "Oh, we all live together and we all believe the same thing, but we're definitely not a cult." And like it was like a joke. Like I made the whole joke about it, and I made that joke, right? That I'm telling you now, wholeheartedly, I swear on everybody who I care about's lives, me making fun of you guys being culty had absolutely not even 0.1% anything to do with you or Priya. It was purely because of it was the perception of DxE from the outside, and it was funny to say it's like a cult. I never believed it was a cult. It was just like a comedy point, like they do to vegans too.
I know that's true because
I've
talked to you and you know me, and I know that you didn't have that animus. But I think the reason those rumors gain traction and actually do real damage, to the point that the government has basically made these sorts of allegations against us. It's not because of any factual reality or factual differences between DxE and other movements or other causes or other even organizations. It's partly because people are more open to that sort of claim when it's someone who's a little foreign. It's like, these people, right? And I think
do you mean because it's like based on maybe because they're basing it on like the most famous cults, like for example Osho and things like that,
or like the Moonies. If you've heard of the Moonies, like a Korean person, and just
so it's a negative stereotype, basically. You think it's
extremely insidious. And I think with the cult stuff, so even the idea that everyone in DxE thinks the same way or dresses the same way. If you walked into the actual DxE community space, people dressed more differently than any space I've ever been.
It's just the outward representation of it. That's all. I'm 100% sure that it's not a cult and culty.
But I'm saying that the reason people believe it, despite the fact that the outward representation that some people were seeing was so different from the inward reality, is partly because the leaders were people of color. I just think that's 100% the case. Because we had an organization where you have Diana Navon, like an upper middle class Berkeley grandmother who dressed up. She's so prim and proper. She has tea every morning. And then we had punk kids with mohawks coming in with tattoos all over their face and like piercings everywhere. It was such a diverse group. Same way in terms of the way we think. If you actually came to one of our chapter meetings, the amount of disagreement there was about everything. Like, you know, I've used this example so many times. I was the co-founder and lead organizer of DxE for many years. And I was like the only person who supported Prop 2 and 12 in the organization. And I would publicly advocate and say, let's do this. And repeatedly, I was outvoted and I was marginalized. And, you know, there's no one, if people knew the number of times, like some of the most prominent campaigns in DxE history were things that I didn't want to do. And we still did them because the movement has a life of its own. And like, to me, the idea that DxE is a group where everyone thinks alike or everyone dresses the same was so different from the reality. I mean, even you, like, you're very different than a lot of other people who are doing DxE all over the world and certainly across Europe. And you didn't get involved in this because it was a cult, but and that did real damage because grassroots activists are an independent, you know, strong-willed bunch, and cults are super scary, and also they're just not cool. Like, you don't be part of a cult. That's like that's what losers do.
So you might be onto something, because I'm just realizing the only other group that's been accused of being a cult is Anonymous for the Voiceless, also run by people of color.
Yeah, I know. Paul in a cell.
Yeah, I have something here.
I think there's a distrust because I mean, every religion is a cult. No offense to people who are super religious, but every religion is a cult. The difference between religions that are not cults and religions that are cults is the religions that are not cults are just familiar. You know, like if you look at Christianity or Islam or any of these religions, if you are not Christian, like in China, when Christians started coming to China and said, hey, there's this dude who walks on water. He turns water into wine. And by the way, he came back to life after dying for 3 days.
My man.
And like, you'd be like, these people are fucking insane. I mean, you got to keep these people out of the country, right? And the only reason they're able to get into China is because they had better guns and just took over the entire place. But, you know, you see it as a cult. But then if it's familiar, and in the United States and Europe, obviously Christianity, all those beliefs I just shared with you are beliefs that are commonly held by, you know, literally billions of people. It doesn't seem like a cult because the beliefs are just normalized. And
right.
So I think sometimes it's not even purely racial. It's just about familiarity. It's like, okay, this is a different belief system. And I will say that's part of what made DxE controversial as well, because we just had different beliefs, but it didn't help. Like, there were so many times that I felt like explicitly or implicitly part of the reason there was distrust of DxE was just because the leaders were people of color. So, for example, I mean, for years, and I don't mean to attack the people running the Animal Rights Conference, but for years, we were not allowed to speak at the Animal Rights Conference.
Which one?
The U.S. National Animal Rights Conference.
Oh, okay.
Or at least like, you know, I'll just give you an example. Pretty much everybody who got arrested or thrown in jail at the Animal Rights Conference in the United States would always get like a keynote presentation because it was seen as like an important thing to show solidarity with people getting thrown in jail. I think one of the only exceptions is me. Like, I was never invited. And again, there are other reasons to that, I'm sure. Maybe it's because I'm controversial. Maybe because I'm not a very good speaker. I'm not saying it's just because I'm a person of color. But I do think part of the reason for that was because and it's not even an explicit thing. It's just like, he's not really one of us. He's a little different in some way.
So it's not, it's firstly, it's horrible that you or anybody would be made to feel that way. And it's not impossible. I can't prove it either way. I would just say one thing. I would be really wary of this, that because you've experienced, or people, not just you, I'm talking to everybody here, like, who's been through this. Once you've experienced something like this, it can be very easy to assume that intent.
Everywhere.
Right, in other situations, everywhere, right? And I would compare it to the God of the Gaps, actually, which is like the concept that throughout history, where when something couldn't be explained, this is where religion stepped in and said, aha, that's because God did it. And I feel like we might maybe sometimes fall into that trap here. And it's not only people of color. I think a lot of white people also look to step in on behalf of people of color and say, well, you know what? Like for example, this case, well, this person's not been invited here, and yeah, everything lines up. Like, well, what reason could they have been? Well, there is no logical reason we can find. Therefore, it must be racism. It's kind of like the God of the gaps. Whereas maybe we dig a little deeper and find the right people and get the truth out of them. And actually, it turns out that somebody just didn't like you as a person, and they would make it a personal decision, which was still shitty, but it's a lot better than racism, right? Which I think, personally, I think that can be the case a lot of the time for me. I think sometimes, it's just because I'm a white guy, but actually, a lot of the time it could just be they don't like the way I do activism. They don't like the way I speak. They find me too abrasive.
They just don't like David Rams.
They just don't like me. And that's also
white, it's that you're David Rams.
Which is, to be honest with you, it's also unpleasant, but it's not quite as unpleasant as it's because you're white. You know what I mean? Whereas, because if it's like, because I don't like you, then I can sit down and say, hey, well, let's talk about that. Why don't you like me? Whereas when it's because you're white, it's like, okay, where the hell? That's a tough conversation to have. Like, if someone's outright saying to your face, I don't want you here because of your skin color. I mean, as you know, that for yourself, that you'd find that hard to navigate with calmly. And as we discussed earlier, this takes a lot of composure to be like, okay, let's figure out why they've got to that conclusion and see if we can nudge them the other way or undo that belief, because that's a nasty belief to hold, Because if they don't like you, it's a lot easier just to keep your temper, I think, though. It's like, okay, well, it's just difference of opinion. That's a different thing altogether, I think.
Yeah. But actually, this is where your advice really is important, which is, go back to first principles and figure out what do we actually know, right? Let's not elaborate. Let's not assume things that aren't there. And even just kind of this correlation you're seeing between cult allegations of people of color. Okay, maybe it is race, but maybe it's not. Maybe they're just attributes of AV and DxE and the Loving Hut that have more cult-like attributes. And even if it is race, again, the response shouldn't be everyone who thinks this is now a scumbag and we hate you all. I mean, first of all, it's not going to help us as people of color who are trying to do something in the movement, but it's just not going to help the movement because and it's not going to help the animals. And again, I didn't join the animal rights movement to fight for Chinese people. I mean, I think it's great for people to fight against anti-Chinese discrimination. I'm glad people are out there doing it. But I became an animal rights activist because there's another set of victims who I'm trying to center in my life. And I'm not saying everyone has to make that choice in the same way that, everyone doesn't have to be a cancer doctor. But if you're going into the cancer wing of a hospital, as a doctor, you should be focused on the cancer patients.
Right.
Don't come in there and scream about how people are getting diabetes and heart attacks and, get in the face of the doctors who are trying to treat someone for cancer and say, don't you realize people have heart attacks? What's wrong with you, idiot? It's like, dude, I'm trying to treat someone for cancer right now. I'm sure that's true. But the space for that is over there. And similarly, the space for
I had
people
a point I wanted to make anyway. So,
and I'm not saying we shouldn't have some conversations about this, but still, I think this is a really healthy conversation. This is a great conversation for us to unpack, because I think sometimes, if, for example, if it were the case that in the cancer wing of a hospital there are all these people getting heart attacks, of course we should think about that too and say, all right, are people getting heart attacks here for some reason? There's some cancer drug causing heart attacks, But at the end of the day, understanding that there's a time and a place for you as an activist to center yourself. Although, as an activist, I think you should basically never be centering yourself. You should always be centering the cause and the movement and the people you represent, whether they're people of color or animals or whatever it is.
Right.
But yeah, we also have to make sure we don't allow these things to metastasize. Well, we got briefly interrupted because of a technical difficulty, but the point I was trying to make was basically don't assume bad faith, assume good faith, and don't invent facts beyond the facts you have. Look into things. And I think one of the ways you get at the answer to this problem is, say someone says AV is a cult. Well, find evidence of it. Don't just, if you want to make sure it's not based on some nonsensical, basically BS rumor that could be even racially tinged in some way, then your obligation is to kind of dig a little deeper into this. And again, start with the first principle, start with the facts you actually have. And that's true on the other side too. If somebody says David Rams is a racist, I'm not going to just accept that just because someone says that, because not just because I know you, but because I know you're a fellow activist and there's great value in us having solidarity, working together. And let me unpack that a little bit. And frankly, even if you were racist in some way, as you said, the right response is let's try and explain this and understand this and help this person figure out why they think that the Chinese are the problem. So, but you said you wanted to say.
Well, yeah, on that exact point, somebody on the stage, when I was on the stage giving this talk, somebody asked the question, do you not think that you have white privilege here? And that's why you're saying all of this. And he said, I'm quite annoyed at the idea that you expect me to work with people who hate me. And I had to say, like, I'm glad you asked me this question. I'm glad you asked it in front of all these people, and that it wasn't some kind of campaigning tweet or something, going after me, because there's been a misunderstanding of what I said. No, I don't want you to work with people who hate you. I'm suggesting that the people you think hate you don't actually hate you, and we should spend a bit of time to find out if they do or not before we make assumptions about them. That's been the whole point of this talk. If you find out somebody genuinely does hate your guts and hates who you are, whether you choose to engage with them anymore is up to you. You could actually just pass it on to somebody else who then spends the time doing it. That's up to you. But the point is, the last thing we should be doing is expelling people. And I said to everybody, what do you think? Pushing somebody away and kicking them out of the movement, say if they are a little bit racist, like as in, like, I say harmlessly racist or relatively harmlessly racist. They make some jokes that are not really nasty, but they're stereotypes, right? They're making jokes about stereotypes, which is like, I think that's like the lowest form of, like, in terms of the potential harm. And so let's say they're doing that. Do you think they'll become more or less racist if you kick them out and tell them never to come back? Which one? Yeah. And everybody went dead silent. No one said a word, and it was kind of like, well, okay, we all know the answer, don't we? So let's try and, not have that happen, because that's the last thing that we need is people to be more. We don't need less people in our movement, and we don't need people to become more racist, right? The two things that we don't need. So that's on your last point. And again, rewinding back to, I think people are going to be wondering, what did this guy say? Because I said earlier on, this guy, and there was all this crowd, and we never got back to it. So this is really interesting because, again, a lot of the stuff you've been saying was said in this conversation. So, yeah, he came forward and said, this. I said the things you said about how we got to find a way to work together, even with people. I mean, the vast majority of the world population holds one or two racist views, at least, minimum, right? The idea that we won't work with any of them because of that is ludicrous. We're not going to achieve anything. We have to figure out a way that we can work with the people regardless of these things that we don't like about them and that we find offensive or harmful, right? Yeah. And he said, well, okay, but then what about if we just can't handle the microaggressions, he said. What if it all gets too much for us, these microaggressions? And I said, I don't want to upset you here. I really don't want to be like, confrontational here, but what we have to face in our movement, what happens to animals, the things that they do to them, and that we have to stand there and watch and film or be there or try and fight against, is far, far more severe and psychologically damaging than microaggressions. So objectively, I feel like I can say that. I think the majority of people out there would say that bothers them. Or, I mean, it should it not bother you more than a microaggression? Anyway, that's a whole separate topic. So if somebody is finding themselves unable... If someone's finding themselves unable to participate in our important work for animals because they're feeling that there are too many microaggressions, maybe this is not the area for them to work in, and maybe they'd be better off in an area like artivism or some kind of creative area where there'd be less of this type of microaggression, but to work within the kind of activism, I don't know, public-facing activism or different forms of activism that require you to be able to be like, have the mental fortitude to get over that, basically, and to keep going forward. That might not be for them. And at this point, a young lady who was a person of color came forward very angry. I said, do you not agree? She said, no, I don't agree. She said, strength is subjective. And I said, yeah, strength, but I'm talking about mental fortitude. She was like, still, it's subjective. How can you demand that activists be strong? How dare you? It's all different. And she just got really offended. And I was trying to explain that, look, I'm not saying you shouldn't be an activist. I'm saying you're going to have to deal with a lot worse than microaggressions when you're doing public-facing activism. And if you can't handle it, then maybe this area of the movement isn't for you. Like, it's about knowing where you are going to be the best for the animals, right? And that might not be the area for you. She was saying, and this is where it brings us right back to you, actually, because she was talking about how, as a person of color, she is not only having to work for animals because she's chosen to do that, she also has to work for herself. And that's something that I don't do. And I said, yeah, you're right in a way, because I have one goal when I do activism, and my goal is I can 100% focus on animals because I don't deal with the issues that a person of color deals with, right? And my goal is just, I'm all about animals. Your goals, you have more than one goal. You have the animal goal. You also have the personal goal of a person being a person of color and fighting for the rights of yourself and others like you. So how can we work together? Because I'm able to focus 100% on animals. And that's, I suppose, in a word of privilege, that I don't have to think about the things she does. And you have to think about those things. So the question is, and it's the gold ticket question, how can you and I keep going together without any conflict, without having any, divisiveness? I think it's possible, right? And she said, okay, yeah, I agree. I think that's a good question. And she calmed right down. And it was actually a really good conversation after that. So, awesome. I think this understanding, it's like I wasn't dismissing her experience. I'll say, okay, well, you're right. Actually, that's not on my mind. I don't have to think about that. I very rarely do until I joined this movement. And then I am thinking about who I am a bit more, because people keep telling me, because you're a white guy, you have this problem. But, in general, I don't have to think about that. And that's something that, you've explained today. You do have to think about that. And I see that. Okay, great. So how do you and I keep going towards our common goals without me stepping on your toes and you stepping on mine? That's the question, basically.
Well, actually, I enjoy it when you step on my toe. So I think it's fun to talk to you, especially when we disagree. Like, I thought our conversation about violence
I thought you were
really
making.
interesting.
Sorry, I thought you were making like a kink joke. I thought you were like.
No.
I was thinking that was pretty quick.
I don't mean literally. For the record, everyone, just so we don't get disinformation out there, David Rams has never stepped on my toes. Don't worry, physically. No, you make so many good points.
Brilliant.
Honestly, one of the things I really love how you responded to that interaction, it relates to the conversation I just had of Leah Garces. Do you know who Leah Garces is? She's the CEO of Merchant for Animals.
Oh, I know a lot of faces, but not names. Yeah, but I would recognize her, I'm sure.
Leah is the one who launched this transformation project where she goes, it's actually very similar to Daryl Davis.
I know exactly who she is. Now you said that.
Farmers. Yeah. Yep. She goes to a bunch of factory farmers and convinces them to convert to mushroom farms or, some other plant-based farm, like, soybeans. And when I asked her, what is the secret sauce? I mean, how are you doing this? She said, well, honestly, the one thing is just curiosity. I ask questions. And you did that really well with this person. Instead of just immediately assuming like, I've got all the answers, you're wrong. You ask, well, like, how do we work together then? Like, we can have these different experiences and even different goals where your goal is partly the animals and partly, making sure this space is safe for you and other people of color. My goal is just focused on the animals. And is there a way for us to work together? I think that was a genius way of trying to resolve the conflict by trying to focus on solutions and focus on the fact that there's uncertainty for all of us. I'm like, you don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is. Let's just figure this out together.
Right.
But a couple of things I want to say.
Sorry, go on. Yeah, I was going to say I have one little point
please, on that point. Tell me
one little thing that people watching this up until now might be thinking like, oh, this guy is so fake because he's sitting here kind of like Gandhi, like, oh yeah, how he's dealing with all these things really well. I know the truth. I know what he said. And I've seen his videos in the past and stuff. And that's one part we haven't touched on yet, because in this talk that I did, I acknowledged that in the past that I had dealt with these types of things terribly, like horribly. Like I had overreacted constantly. I made videos that were just, they weren't nasty, but they were so divisive and inflammatory. And I've removed all of them. If you're watching this and you find one, just tell me, DM me, oh, this is one of them. I'll take it down. I don't want them online anymore. I feel, I don't regret it because it's like, it's who I was then. And it's good that it got me to where I am now. But to be clear, this has not always been the case. But we're talking about now how calmly and looking to this has not been the case. I have poured fuel on a lot of fires in my life in this movement because, I don't know, I guess I was hurt, I was offended, I was pissed off about these things. And I wasn't looking for a solution. I was looking to beat the other people. I was looking to prove them wrong. And all that did was make everything worse. Even if I proved them, even if I proved myself right, even if this is a thing I'm writing an article about too. Sometimes, even when you win the argument, you still lose.
Lose the war, yeah.
You still lose because
you lose, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I was doing that. I was doing that so often. Oh, I'm logically right, but everyone still hates me, and I've not fixed any of these. I've not fixed any of these divisions. and there was no nuance. And so now I've learned that there's definitely nuance, and it's much better to handle these things the way we've been talking about here than what I did in the past. I just wanted to acknowledge that anyway, because, you know,
I think that's beautiful. And I think it's a demonstration of your ability to grow. And I think everyone should be striving to be that sort of person. But how did you get there? Because you see a lot of people who are stuck in this defensive mindset and can't learn. I mean, how do you think you got there?
So I had, okay. I was definitely, when I joined the movement, it was on the up, and it was all very exciting. And, you know, there was all these really powerful, strongly spoken activists. And it was all about, I know it felt like a bit of a competition, like who's going to be the more bold one, who's going to be the more, and so there wasn't really a lot of room for self-reflection. And actually I never self-reflected. I was just on to the next every time, next video. I never even thought for a second, is what I'm doing, does it make sense, right? And is how I'm reacting good here? It's like you said earlier on, I wasn't acting like a responsible person. I was acting like somebody who was just, oh, I feel this way, so I'll say it, constantly, without any kind of strategy, any kind of tactic or anything. And what helped me to start realizing that actually was I started to kind of see things that I didn't agree with in other activists around me, that the things they would say on social media or things they would, you know, do. And I started to kind of look and think, wait, I don't think that that's very, you know, I mean, obviously it might be useful, I don't know, but I don't feel quite that to be very, the most productive way of being. And wait, have I been doing that? And I'm like, oh God, yeah, I've been doing that a lot. And wow, okay. And it just they started with little things. And then I was like, okay, maybe I'll go research that. I'll go research the human behavior and what's the studies on this. And actually it shows that isn't productive. And a lot of research is quite clear on a lot of the things that, you know, that aren't good to do when you're trying to convince people, and things that are good to do. And I started to realize that, oh, wait a minute, I've been doing the opposite, basically, in some cases of good. And in terms of divisiveness with other activists, throughout the years, I keep talking about how we all need to learn to get along. But then I suddenly realized that, well, a lot of people are angry at me, that maybe I'm one of the people that they're talking about, like, oh, we need to learn to get along, you know? I don't know. I can't pinpoint an exact moment. I think it might have, maybe it's age, maybe just getting a bit older, calming down a little bit. I also took a big break at the same time.
How old are you, David?
36 next year, 35 now. I don't know why I said 36 next year, but it's getting on a bit, you know, a little bit. But I don't know. I mean, I got into activism 2017.
Cosplaying as an old man.
I don't know.
I'm 43 years old, so you better not call us old, because I don't feel old.
I don't know. I think maybe I took a little break as well. I stepped back from making videos as much as I did. I spent basically from 2019, 2020 through to like 2022, just non-stop content, like 2.5 years, 3 years, just never stopping. And I took some lengthy time off. And I think maybe all these lessons that would have come to me back in 2021 started to come then, like once I took a breather and started to look a little closer. And I read Tobias Leenaert's book as well, which was that really helped. I was already on that path, and I read his book and I was like, oh, well, I mean, there you go then. Like, that was really helpful. You know, How to Create a Vegan World? You know that book?
I haven't read that. I mean, I know. Oh, man. Obviously.
Oh, that's really interesting. I thought you would know it. Yeah, you should read it. It's a really interesting book. I don't think you'll agree with everything, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there that was backing up what I was thinking myself, and it helped put a few pieces together. And then the conferences really helped too, like listening to people and realizing, wow, these people have been doing this for 20 odd years, sometimes more. And I should have been paying attention to these people a little sooner, because these are not just people with opinions. They're like, oh, here's my 20 years of data. Like, wow, okay, so you actually have some kind of tangible stuff here to show us what doesn't work based on 20 years of not experience, but 20 years of like, here we did this, and here's what happened. And, you know, facts, like not feelings, right?
Yeah.
So the conferences have been really helpful for that as well. So yeah, it's an amalgamation of all of that.
Yeah. Have you met Tobias?
Yeah.
I've heard he's a great guy. I've never met him, but it's pretty interesting. The situation of Tobias, and the reason I haven't read his book, is a fascinating example of how movement conflict erupts. Because Tobias and I have been sort of different camps in the movement for a long time. Like, he's known as being skeptical of direct action, confrontation, that sort of thing. to me, it's partly because he doesn't understand what we're trying to do. But I think one of the reasons I've never talked to him is because the way these movement conflicts happen a lot of times is there's one camp and another camp. There's like the more welfarist camp, there's the abolitionist camp. And it literally can be just two random people in each of the camps getting into some fight on Facebook. Like just one of them says, well, you're an idiot. And the other person says, well, you're a scumbag coward. And then that rumor, it's like what you were saying about people getting away from first principles, right?
Right.
That rumor turns into, oh, did you hear that the welfarists are all accusing anyone who's an abolitionist of being a scumbag because they're co-opted by the industry? And then the welfarists all talk in their group about how, oh, did you hear about the abolitionists are calling us all cowards? They all think we're cowardly just because we're actually trying to make change and they're living in a delusional fantasy world. And that trickles up and spreads throughout both of these communities to the point that they're all attacking each other. And then even someone, and this is one of the weird aspects of leadership. Like leadership is very strange because most people think leaders lead, which would make sense because it's literally in the word leadership. But a lot of times as leaders, you're kind of trapped and you follow the group. And it's really, really hard when you're a leader, when your entire group is moving in a certain direction and saying all the welfarists are scum. And that's especially true when they're, I don't mean to call anyone out, but I kind of will. But when you have people like Gary Francione, who I think is actually a brilliant philosopher. Do you know Gary Francione?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he's brilliant. I think he's one of the most important animal rights philosophers in history. I think he's got incredibly profound insight into strategy and rhetoric, but he's an asshole. He is so mean to everyone. Like, no, I kid you not. If you check out his Facebook page, the moment you disagree with him about anything, he immediately insults your intelligence. He says you're stupid or you're a coward. And you have these kind of demagogues on each side. And you see this in politics too. Like you have Netanyahu and Trump and then people on the left doing the same thing, where they take the concept in political science is called threat inflation. And this actually relates to the microaggressions you were talking earlier. It's where you take like a small dispute about, like two random people just having a little Facebook argument, and you inflate the threat into some existential threat to the entire animal rights movement. Instead of just, hey, these two people had a little disagreement on Facebook about welfarism. Welfarists are endangering the entire animal rights movement and are being corrupted. And on the other hand, abolitionists are these delusional radicals who are endangering the animal rights movement. And you see the same thing with race politics too, where, maybe someone tells a little off-color joke about Chinese people. Like Russell Peters says this joke about how Chinese people are greedy. And it's like, all right, I mean, it's a little racist, whatever. But he's not trying to commit genocide against Chinese people. And then like 2 steps later, you have someone who says like Russell Peters is a racist. And the next person says Russell Peters wants to exterminate all the Chinese people off the face of the planet Earth. And it's like, whoa, that's a big jump. Like, he said like a little off-color joke about Chinese people. He's not promoting hate crimes against Chinese people. He just said a little off-color joke. And maybe you shouldn't have told it. Maybe it's okay. I mean, people have different perspectives on what sort of comedy is allowed and what sort of comedy isn't allowed, what sort of comedy is ethical, what sort of comedy is not. But it's not genocide. And a lot of times what happens is these things get inflated. That's partly due to what you were talking about, first principles and just the telephone chain. But it's also partly because like modern, I think this is especially true of progressives, but increasingly it's true of the right too. There's almost like social cred you get from inflating the threat to be as big as possible, because then people pay more attention to. Because if you said to someone, oh yeah, there was like a mild form of implicit bias that was demonstrated in that conversation, and it didn't harm me that much, but
bored, move on, next.
Move on, no one cares.
That's why, exactly.
I was a victim of a hate crime. Then everyone's like, ooh.
Okay, the comments of that one.
Yeah,
you want to go read it?
I'm so sorry. I love you. You're amazing. You're so brave. And they don't realize, what the hate crime they're talking about is Russell Peters, who's an Indian person himself, just told a slightly off-color joke, which it's different from like a violent hate crime. It's whatever you think of off-color jokes about Chinese people. It's not a violent hate crime. It's just an off-color joke. And
let me tap something onto that as well, because it's not. It is what you've just said, and it's even worse than you're saying. This what did you call it? The threat inflation, inflation, right? So there's one more element to it that makes it so much worse on top of that. So back in the days, way back, which you'll remember as well, before the internet, before social media, before all this stuff, right? If you were going to do threat inflation, you would have to wait for like the weekend, you know? So say on Monday someone makes the joke, right? And you want to make a big deal about it. So like, okay, then say it happens at the pub on a Saturday. You're at the bar Saturday, right? Okay, you're going to see them next Saturday at the bar. You got a whole week and you're like, do you know what? I've been thinking about that joke, and next Saturday, like it gets to Monday, you're feeling it, you're thinking about it at work. You're like, I don't like that joke. On Saturday, I'm going to bring it up. It's a hate crime, right? By the time Saturday rolls around, you probably don't still think it's a hate crime. You probably calm down. You're probably just happy that it's the weekend, and you're like, do you know what? Let's just, he's a bit of a whatever. It doesn't matter. Let's just get over it, right? But the difference between that and nowadays, it's like, okay, you're upset. You go, do you know what? I'm going to like inflate it. Oh, it's a hate crime. And you just grab your phone and tweet it. Boom, done. It takes literally a minute, and there's no punishment if you get it wrong. If you ruin someone's life, nothing happens to you. And even if after the fact, imagine that person actually has found out that there wasn't a hate crime, actually. They lost their job, they lost their family, their wife left them, all this stuff over this because of the pressure and all the horror. And then it turns out that you actually feel bad, and do you know what? That wasn't a hate crime. And you put out there on the internet, you say, hey, do you know what? I overreacted. Doesn't change that person's life. They might get their job back, maybe. They might get their wife back. But the internet will always remember that person as a racist. There is no amount of cleanup you can do to change the minds of people once they've already had that thing stamped on them. And that's the world we're in right now. And how terrifying is that? Like, what you've just said, threat inflation, the speed of the phone, the permanence of it all. Yeah. Wow. What a horrible couple of things that is, you know?
Yeah. What do you think the implications of that are, though? I mean, does that mean we just have to all get off social media? Because social media is such a huge part of what you do and what I do, right?
No, I think let's bring it back to animal rights then, because it's our movement. So in our movement, that example I was just giving would be about abolition. So let's say on a Saturday at a animal rights event, someone says something about welfarism that you think, and you're actually working welfare, and they say welfarists are pussies, right? Something horrible like that. and then you go to work on the Monday, you're like, you know what? I'm gonna. Like, that's an anti-welfare stance. That's actually like really bothers me. I'm going to make a big deal of this. By the weekend comes around, if you don't put it on Facebook or anything, you might be a lot calmer. So I'd say as activists, just imagine you didn't have access to social media, and just remind yourself that not everything needs to go to social media. If you want to make a point, make it to the person and to the group that needs to hear it, not to the bloody world. Because let me tell you something. If you've got an issue over in the USA and some, I don't know, like wherever DxE is based now. Sorry, what's it called again? Your base over there? DxE, what's the city you guys live in? Mainly. Yeah, but like the area. Say again?
Berkeley,
right. So say something happens in Berkeley. Let me tell you something right now, okay? I don't need to hear about it. The Spanish vegan movement doesn't need to hear about it. Right? We don't need to hear about it. Iceland's vegans don't need to hear about it. No one else needs to hear about it. You guys sort it out with your team, and you discuss it and you fix it. It doesn't need to go to the internet. It doesn't need to go public if someone says something mean about welfarism or abolitionism. So in that example, that's how we deal with it. But back to the point about abolition and welfarism, actually,
social media encourages you to not do that.
Oh yeah, encourages you to just
you will like get more likes and more attention if after this conversation I post this video and the title is David Rams is a racist. The number of people who will watch that is so high, and it like
the number of people who
encourages intemperance, right?
The number of people who won't watch it, they will look at the title and then just say, "I knew it." The people who I don't like me already, that would be a big problem, and there will be a lot of people who never heard of me who will just take that title and run with it and say, "Oh, the next time they hear my name, they'll just go, oh, I heard he's a racist." Exactly. It's so dangerous. I actually made the comparison at my talk about this about how it's like a difference between a musket and a 9mm, right? Because the musket, you would have to do the gunpowder, you'd have to put the bullet in, you have to shove it all down. It takes a couple of minutes. By the time you've loaded it, maybe you don't want to shoot the person anymore. Whereas a 9mm handgun, it's instant, bam. And that's what a mobile phone is now. Like, this is the 9mm. It's not a letter. You know, you have to sit down, get your pen, you have to get your paper out, you have to actually handwrite a letter. Halfway into the letter, maybe you actually don't want to say these things anymore because you're calming down, you know? So it's super dangerous. Yeah, it's a real problem. But I wanted to touch on also, you mentioned the abolition welfarism thing. Something I've learned from going to all these conferences and meeting all these people is that the vast majority of people who the abolitionists would class as welfarists are abolitionists.
Yeah, 100%.
They're just using welfare as a strategy.
Yeah,
They don't want welfare as the end goal. And there are some who do, don't get me wrong, but like 9 out of 10 are like, oh no, I want an end. Like but they can't say that too publicly because then they'll, you know what I mean? They lose their positions of influence, right? How they got to positions in the EU and stuff, for example, is by saying they're all about welfare. But no, they want it to end. They want it all to come down. So yeah. But that's something that a lot of abolitionists don't know.
Is a great example of this. I mean, there are so many people who've condemned Leah Garces, including people in my camp. And I will say, I mean, the conversation I just had with Leah was partly a result of that personal contact because we just ran into each other randomly at Ava, had a really pleasant conversation. And I think she realized, oh, all these like abolitionists who've been attacking us online, that's not representative of Wayne. And I also realized, oh, you know, all these welfarists who say I'm a radical who deserves to go to jail, that's not Leah. You know, that's like just random people on the internet who are in the welfarist camp, who many of them might not be abolitionists. But Leah in her heart, you know, so much like so many of these so-called welfarists, like Friedrich or Josh Bullock. I mean, a lot of people who I've gotten to know, they want every animal to be protected from violence. They want to abolish animal abuse, just like I do. And you're right, it's a strategy, but part of the reason we overcame it was just because of the personal contact. And conversation we had is great and shows how there are connections between all of this work. The other piece of advice I think the animal rights should enshrine in its culture, beyond just asking each of us to use the musket and not the 9mm, or maybe when you use the musket, you realize you don't want either of them. You know, let's not shoot anybody.
That's the point. Yeah.
No, exactly. But because everybody does have a 9mm. I'd love for it to be the case that we had the power of social media without the immediacy and the encouragement of like emotional overreactions, which is what social media does. Because the more inflammatory your allegation is, the more attention the algorithm gives it. I think it has to be a collective commitment. When you see someone else pulling out the 9mm or the musket, for example, all of us have an obligation to intervene and say, like, look, this is too much. You know, and it doesn't mean you have to post on the internet and respond. But if you see your friend posting, you know, Wayne Hsiung as a cult leader or David Ram, whatever it is, give them a call and say like, hey, you know, tell me more about this. Like, do you have evidence behind this? And like, do you think this is the most productive thing for the movement? Or maybe even say like, I actually know David and I know he's not a racist. And I'd love to put you in touch maybe, or just for you to hear my experience with him. And as a person of color who's experienced a lot of racism, honestly, David's welcomed me. And, you know, you support an organization that I started. And there weren't a lot of people back then doing that. And you did it. So the idea that David Ram's a racist is totally inconsistent with my experience. And maybe you said something that was a little off color at some point. I don't know. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Or maybe it's just a misinterpretation and you interpreted it a certain way and you didn't mean it. But I bet there's a way you can figure this out. I think all of us have to collectively commit to intervene. And the same way we've collectively committed to intervening to stop violence against animals. That's what we do as vegans. We also have to intervene to prevent kind of the internal conflicts within the movement from preventing us from stopping the violence against animals. Because if we don't work together, we can't stop violence against animals. And so all of us have to take that upon ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I'm super glad. Like in many ways, the talk you gave, you had to bite the bullet because I think there were a lot of people thinking the things you were thinking, including me, and just weren't willing to bite the bullet. And you did it. So I'm really grateful to you for that. And it doesn't mean I'm sure I wasn't at the talk because I'm not allowed to leave the United States. So I would have been if I could. I wasn't at the talk, but I did see a version of it before you gave it. And I gave you comments, and I don't necessarily agree with everything you said, but I do 100% believe you were acting in good faith. And I also think you were arriving at fundamental truths that all of us should be thinking about. So, it's awesome, David.
No, I appreciate it. The talk will be online at some point on the International Animal Rights Conference YouTube. So it'll be there if you want to watch it and see if you. Sure. And then we can do we can talk privately and see if what disagreements you had from it. I'm curious to see. I guess I'll give a practical example of what you were saying as well, I guess, before we sign off, about the kind of helping each other out and watching each other and making sure we don't flip out in the comments or whatever and things like that. That's something that I try to do. It is a difficult path to walk because you don't want to be acting like mum or dad, someone's mum or dad. Hey, we need to talk about this. Yeah. But I'll give you an example. Recently, a newer activist had a bit of a conflict with another activist in his comment section. I spotted it, and it was very bad. It was a very unproductive, hot mess. And I messaged him and said, hey, do you have a minute to talk about this comment string? And he said, actually, I'd like a call, if that's all right, which surprised me, which is much better. We jumped on a call, and he was already just saying, I know, I've completely, he knew immediately. He knew it was wrong and messed up. Even though he might have been technically right in what he was saying, the way he put it across was just, whew, and it really escalated it. We had a really good talk about how, as someone who's been doing this for a long time, it's a tough lesson to learn that's not the best way to deal with these conflicts. And it took me years. So I was basically saying, I hope they can speed you up by 5 years or whatever. And it was a really good conversation. We just got to the bottom of it, and he totally agreed. And I think most people would agree. I think this problem is self-reflection. And I think sometimes you need somebody else to say, hey, do you fully back what you said there? And that's all it takes. And they say, do you know what? I don't, because now I read it back with your kind of critical eye on it. Now I'm being critical, and I'm like, wow, that might have been a bit much, Sometimes you don't even need to do any work yourself. Just pointing it out to them, say, hey, reflect on that. What do you think? Is enough for them to say, yeah, that's not cool, actually. So you don't need to go lecturing people, don't need to give people lessons, you don't need to tell them off, you don't need to be like, hey, I'm calling you out, you should have done that. Nothing like that. Just say, hey, have another think about that and tell me what you think. You think it could have been a bit less hostile, maybe? Yeah. What do you think? Was there a better way to put that? That wasn't. Yeah.
Well, I've told you this in person, but you are a leader, David, and I'm very, very grateful to you for being a part of the movement. I think we need more people like you learning the lessons you've learned. So thank you for everything you've been doing for the animals, for the movement. Thank you for giving this talk. And let's definitely talk privately about the content after it goes up. I'll give it a watch, and I'll for sure share it to my Substack.
Sounds good. Sounds good, man. Thank you as always, Wayne, for this is a minor part of what you do, these podcasts, but it's really cool that you're doing them, and of course for everything else you're getting up to. And if you do end up locked up at any point again, we'll be sending you letters. It's letters of support from around the world once again. But hopefully, well, I don't know if you want that or not, actually. We're going to go into a whole other discussion here if we get into this. But anyway, either way, I hope you get what you're looking for from the amazing work that you're doing, and I hope your strategies pan out. There you go. That's the best way of putting it.
Let's hope whatever happens is good for the animals. That's
absolutely.
Yeah. All right, my friend. Until next time, okay?
Cheers, man.
We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.